The courtroom buzzes with tension as a black man in handcuffs enters, his quiet dignity unshaken. Across the room, the smug arresting officer exchanges a cocky grin with his colleagues, confident he's about to see his suspect brought to justice. But when the judge glances at the paperwork and her expression shifts, the officer's smirk fades. Whispers ripple through the courtroom. Just who is this man? What happens next leaves everyone in the room speechless. The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban neighborhood, the air crisp and peaceful. Samuel Bennett, dressed in a tailored navy suit that hinted at his meticulous nature, stepped out of his modest home, briefcase in one hand and the leash of his golden retriever in the other. At 42, Samuel carried himself with an understated confidence, a man who had worked hard to succeed but never flaunted his accomplishments. His mornings were routine, a brisk walk with his dog followed by a commute to the courthouse, where he served as an advisor for legal reforms. Today felt no different. He nodded at a neighbor tending her garden, pausing only to help an elderly woman struggling with her grocery bags. "Thank you, young man," she whispered, her voice shaky but warm. Samuel's kindness came naturally. Small acts of goodwill reminded him of the community values his family cherished. As he continued toward the bus stop, the familiar sound of a police cruiser approaching reached his ears. He barely glanced at it, his mind occupied with the day's agenda. But something made him slow his steps. The cruiser didn't pass by as usual. It slowed to a crawl, its tires crunching on the asphalt. Samuel glanced sideways, catching the intense glare of the officer behind the wheel. The car came to an abrupt stop. "You there?" "Hold up," barked Officer Ethan Blake, a white cop with a hardened expression. He stepped out of the vehicle, hand resting on his holster. Samuel instinctively raised his hand slightly, his calm demeanor masking a flicker of unease. "Yes, officer, is there a problem?" Samuel asked, his voice measured. Blake's eyes swept over Samuel, his suit, his briefcase, the dog at his side. None of it seemed to register. "You're acting suspicious. Loitering around here," Blake snapped. "Suspicious?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I'm on my way to work." Blake wasn't listening. His tone sharpened, his accusations vague but relentless. Samuel felt the stares of passing pedestrians, their steps quickening as they avoided getting involved. He answered each question patiently, presenting his ID when asked. But Blake's expression only grew more hostile. "Let me see your bag," Blake demanded. Samuel hesitated, his frustration mounting. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'd like to know why you're stopping me." That was enough to tip Blake over the edge. "Are you resisting?" he snarled, stepping closer. Before Samuel could reply, Blake spun him around, pressing him against the cruiser. The click of handcuffs echoed in the still morning air. Bystanders murmured uneasily. The elderly woman Samuel had helped earlier tried to speak up, but Blake silenced her with a sharp glare. "Step back, ma'am. I've got this under control." As the cruiser pulled away, Samuel sat in the back seat, his wrists sore and his dignity bruised. He glanced out the window at the neighborhood fading behind him, his mind racing. He had faced discrimination before, but this was new. What Officer Blake didn't know was that Samuel Bennett wasn't just any man. And by the time the courtroom doors opened the next morning, the world was about to find out who he truly was. The atmosphere at the police station was stifling. Samuel Bennett, still in handcuffs, was led through the front doors under the watchful gaze of officers and staff. His tailored suit and calm demeanor seemed out of place in the sterile, chaotic environment of clattering keyboards, ringing phones, and barking commands. Officer Blake walked with exaggerated confidence, as though parading his catch to an unseen audience. "Got another one thinking he's above the law," he muttered loudly enough for nearby officers to hear. A couple of them chuckled, their laughter tinged with something Samuel couldn't ignore: complicity. Samuel said nothing, his expression stoic, but his mind simmering with a mix of disbelief and quiet anger. He'd done nothing wrong, yet here he was being treated like a criminal. Blake shoved him into a wooden chair near the booking desk, his hand gripping Samuel's shoulder longer than necessary. "Name?" barked the officer at the desk. "Samuel Bennett," he replied, his voice steady. Blake leaned against the desk, smirking. "Yeah, sure. And I'm the governor." He nudged Samuel's briefcase with his boot. "What's in there?" "Probably something we should know about." Samuel resisted the urge to respond. Years of dealing with subtle and overt racism had taught him the power of restraint. Still, watching Blake casually unzip his briefcase and carelessly dump its contents, legal documents, a leather-bound notebook, and his laptop onto the desk made his stomach churn. "What's all this? Some kind of scam?" Blake asked, flipping through papers without regard. "They're legal briefs." Samuel replied calmly. "If you look closely, you'll see they're addressed to the courthouse." Blake's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that." The booking process dragged on, each step feeling like an exercise in humiliation. Samuel was photographed, fingerprinted, and asked a series of invasive questions. He answered each one with patience, though his frustration was mounting. "You're awfully calm for someone in your position." Blake sneered. "Maybe that's because I've done nothing wrong." Samuel replied evenly, meeting Blake's gaze. Blake's jaw tightened. He muttered something under his breath before signaling another officer to take Samuel to a holding cell. Inside the cold, dimly lit cell, Samuel finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He sat on the metal bench, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap. He knew better than to let his anger show. It would only feed their narrative. As the hours ticked by, snippets of conversation reached him from the station floor. Words like fraud and money laundering floated in the air, each accusation more absurd than the last. Samuel shook his head. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the courtroom would become his stage, and the truth would come to light. Ethan Blake's confidence was at its peak as he prepared for what he assumed would be an easy courtroom win. Dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, he strode into the courthouse with an air of self-assuredness, exchanging casual nods with colleagues who looked at him with mild curiosity. After all, Officer Blake was known for his strong opinions about keeping the streets clean, and today was just another step in what he saw as his mission to do so. In the holding room, Samuel Bennett, calm as ever, waited patiently, clad in a sleek, tailored suit. His composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension Ethan seemed eager to cultivate. Samuel's quiet confidence only seemed to irritate Ethan further. As Samuel was escorted to the courtroom in handcuffs, Ethan leaned over to another officer, smirking. "This one thinks he's above it all. Let's see him explain himself today." The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the session began. The audience, comprising court staff, curious onlookers, and a few reporters, exchanged whispers, noting the stark differences between the defendant and the officer accusing him. Samuel carried himself with a calm professionalism that felt out of place for someone accused of resisting arrest. His well-tailored suit, polished shoes, and briefcase, now neatly organized after its rough treatment at the station, painted a picture of someone far removed from the accusations against him. Ethan's overconfidence showed as he sat in the gallery, gloating to a colleague about how these cases never go anywhere. His mind replayed the scene of the arrest, where he had felt in complete control. He was so certain of his moral high ground that he ignored the subtle glances exchanged among court staff and even a few jurors who appeared to sense something was off. As Samuel sat with his lawyer, their whispered exchanges exuded quiet assurance. Ethan noticed this and felt a brief flicker of unease. How could someone accused of resisting arrest and loitering remain so calm? Brushing off the thought, Ethan convinced himself that Samuel's demeanor was a facade, one that would crumble as soon as the charges were laid out. The tension in the room thickened as the session progressed. Ethan, seated confidently in the courtroom, couldn't help but feel a strange shift in the atmosphere. The murmurs grew quieter, replaced by a palpable curiosity. Samuel's quiet resolve and lack of visible fear seemed to unsettle the courtroom. Though Ethan refused to admit it, even to himself, Samuel surveyed the room with a piercing gaze that missed nothing. His posture was composed, his expression unreadable. But there was a subtle energy about him, a quiet storm waiting for the right moment to break. Ethan dismissed it as a bluff, reassuring himself that he held all the power in this situation. Yet, deep down, the tiniest sliver of doubt began to form, even as he adjusted his uniform and prepared for what he was sure would be a simple, straightforward outcome. As the charges were about to be read, Ethan glanced over at Samuel one last time, noting the man's calm demeanor. The officer's earlier smugness lingered, but the courtroom itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as though it knew something Ethan didn't. The stage was set for a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything Ethan thought he understood about power and authority. The room grew still as the judge, a composed woman in her late 50s, with a reputation for fairness and sharp wit, took her seat. The gavel struck the podium with a resounding crack, silencing the murmurs and focusing everyone's attention. Samuel Bennett was called to stand, his cuffed wrists jangling faintly as he rose. Ethan Blake leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his smirk more evident than ever. For him, this was the highlight of the day, the moment where Samuel's guilt would be cemented. The clerk began to read the charges aloud: loitering, resisting arrest, and suspicious behavior. The words hung in the air, sounding paper-thin against Samuel's composed presence. Murmurs rippled across the gallery as onlookers whispered about the absurdity of the accusations. Samuel's calm expression betrayed no emotion, though his sharp eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, who remained smug and self-assured. Judge Whitaker adjusted her glasses and picked up the case file, scanning its contents with practiced efficiency. As she read through the details, her expression subtly shifted. At first, she looked puzzled, her brow furrowing slightly. Then her gaze snapped up, landing squarely on Samuel. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying an edge of curiosity. "Is this information correct?" Samuel nodded, offering no further explanation. The room grew tense, an electrified silence spreading as everyone leaned in, sensing something significant was about to unfold. The judge's eyes returned to the file, her expression now one of realization mixed with disbelief. Slowly, she set the papers down and folded her hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone measured but carrying the weight of importance. "This court has just become aware of information that significantly alters the context of this case. Mr. Samuel Bennett is not an ordinary defendant." She paused, letting the room absorb her words. "He is the younger brother of Governor Alexander Bennett." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. Ethan's smirk disappeared instantly, his face draining of color, as though the very floor beneath him had given way. The arrogance he'd worn like armor dissolved, replaced by visible panic. His jaw slackened, and he cast a quick, desperate glance at Samuel, who stood motionless, his calm demeanor unshaken. The murmurs escalated as the judge continued. "Governor Bennett is a well-respected leader in this state, known for his advocacy for justice and equality. It is deeply troubling that Mr. Bennett, an innocent man, was subjected to this treatment." Ethan felt the weight of the room shift against him. Every pair of eyes seemed to bore into him, their judgment palpable. His earlier confidence was now a distant memory. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized the gravity of his actions. Samuel's lawyer stood, presenting additional credentials that confirmed Samuel's identity beyond any doubt. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "this incident is a clear example of racial profiling. My client was subjected to humiliation and wrongful treatment simply because of the color of his skin." The judge nodded, her expression grim. Turning her gaze toward Ethan, she asked pointedly, "Officer Blake, do you have any justification for this arrest beyond the baseless claims listed here?" Ethan stammered, fumbling for words. I thought he was acting suspiciously," he finally managed, his voice shaking. "He wouldn't answer my questions properly, and—" "Enough," the judge interrupted, her tone ice cold. "Your assumptions and biases have no place in this courtroom or in law enforcement." Samuel finally spoke, his voice steady but cutting. "Your Honor, I've endured enough of this systemic injustice in my life to know that silence only enables it. I refuse to let this incident be swept under the rug. This is not just about me. It's about every person who's been profiled, humiliated, or worse because of their race." The courtroom fell silent, Samuel's words resonating deeply. Judge Whitaker nodded solemnly. "Mr. Bennett, I commend your composure and your courage. Rest assured, this court will take every necessary step to address what has happened here." As Samuel sat down, his dignity unshaken, Ethan Blake remained frozen, his world crumbling around him. The officer's once confident swagger was gone, replaced by the stark realization of the consequences he would soon face. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Judge Whitaker's gavel slammed down, silencing the room. Her piercing gaze turned toward Ethan Blake, who now sat slumped in his seat, his once smug confidence entirely erased. The judge leaned forward, her tone a chilling mixture of authority and disbelief. "Officer Blake," she began, her voice carrying the weight of the room, "you have been accused of egregious misconduct. This court demands an immediate explanation for your actions." Ethan stammered, struggling to maintain composure. "Your Honor, I was following protocol," he said weakly. "He was acting suspicious." The judge raised an eyebrow, her expression icy. "Suspicious? Mr. Bennett, a man walking his dog in his own neighborhood, was suspicious to you? Do you have evidence to support this claim? Or did you simply act on your assumptions?" Ethan faltered, the room waiting in charged silence. "It wasn't like that," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I thought he might be up to something." "Thought!" Judge Whitaker interjected sharply. "Officer Blake, you are sworn to uphold the law based on facts, not prejudiced assumptions. Your actions have brought disgrace upon your badge and this court." The judge then turned to Samuel, who sat composed, watching Ethan without malice but with a penetrating stare. "Mr. Bennett, you've shown remarkable dignity in the face of profound injustice. You had every right to react with anger, yet you chose not to. The strength you've demonstrated is commendable." She looked back at Ethan, her voice growing colder. "Officer Blake, your conduct represents a gross abuse of power. This court will not tolerate such behavior." The room hung in stunned silence as Judge Whitaker announced the immediate consequences. Effective immediately, Officer Blake is suspended pending a full investigation into his actions. Furthermore, the police department's conduct will be reviewed for systemic biases. Ethan's face paled as the weight of her words hit him. His career, his reputation, all of it teetered on the brink of collapse. He attempted to protest. "Your Honor, I didn't mean any harm." "You didn't mean harm?" The judge interrupted, her voice rising with uncharacteristic anger. "Do you think your intentions absolve you of the harm caused?" Mr. Bennett was humiliated, arrested without cause, and paraded through your station like a criminal, all because of your baseless assumptions. The courtroom murmured in agreement. Ethan slumped further into his chair, realizing there was no salvaging the situation. His fellow officers shifted uncomfortably, some shooting him disapproving glances, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Judge Whitaker concluded firmly, "This case will serve as a reminder that no one is above accountability, especially not those entrusted with enforcing the law. Officer Blake, you are dismissed for today. Further actions will be communicated pending the outcome of the investigation." As Ethan was escorted out, the tension in the courtroom lifted slightly, replaced by a quiet sense of justice served. Samuel sat tall and resolute, his silent strength a stark contrast to Ethan's retreating figure. The fallout from Samuel Bennett's wrongful arrest exploded across social media and news outlets within hours of the courtroom revelation. Headlines like "Racial Profiling Gone Wrong," "Governor's Brother Arrested Without Cause," and "Justice Miscarried," "Officer Blake Under Investigation" dominated the airwaves, sparking nationwide outrage. The story's virality was propelled by a video taken by a bystander at the scene of Samuel's arrest. The clip, showing a composed Samuel being forcibly cuffed despite his polite compliance, left viewers appalled and angry. Hashtags such as hashtag justice for Samuel and hashtag end racial profiling began trending within minutes, and thousands of comments flooded in from people expressing solidarity with Samuel and condemning the officer's actions. "This could have been any one of us," wrote one commenter. Another added, "It doesn't matter who you are. No one deserves to be treated like this." On the evening news, pundits dissected the case, highlighting how systemic bias continues to plague law enforcement. Panels of experts debated how the incident reflected larger societal issues, and clips of Judge Whitaker's fiery reprimand of Officer Blake played on repeat. One legal analyst remarked, "This wasn't just a mistake. It was a blatant example of the dangers of unchecked prejudice." Meanwhile, Samuel's identity as the governor's brother added another layer to the story. Governor Bennett issued a public statement, his voice firm but measured as he addressed the injustice his brother faced. This incident is a painful reminder of the challenges so many Americans face daily. My brother's dignity and the court's swift action highlight that accountability is essential, but there's still much work to do. I stand with Samuel and every individual who has experienced such treatment. Together, we must demand better. Protests erupted in cities across the country, calling for sweeping reforms in police practices. Peaceful demonstrators carried signs reading, "No justice, no peace and protect, don't profile," as they marched through urban centers and small towns alike. Samuel's story had touched a nerve, igniting a movement that extended far beyond the courtroom. Back in the small suburban neighborhood where it all began, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Neighbors who had once turned away in discomfort during Samuel's arrest now stepped forward to voice their support. Some even held a candlelight vigil outside his home, holding placards that read, "We stand with Samuel." At the same time, the police department faced an unprecedented wave of scrutiny. Anonymous officers leaked reports of a toxic culture within the precinct, where profiling was tacitly tolerated. The department scrambled to respond, with the police chief announcing a full-scale review of policies and promising transparency. Ethan Blake became the target of widespread criticism. His face, plastered across headlines and memes, became a symbol of racial bias. His colleagues distanced themselves, and his superiors were forced to reckon with the damage done to their credibility. Despite the chaos, Samuel remained composed, using his newfound platform to emphasize the importance of reform. "This isn't just about me," he told a reporter during a brief interview. "It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." The fallout from the courtroom revelation left Officer Ethan Blake reeling. Once confident in his actions, he now found himself the subject of intense public scrutiny, departmental investigations, and widespread condemnation. His colleagues, once indifferent to his arrogance, began avoiding him, muttering about how his behavior had brought shame to the force. The first major blow came during his disciplinary hearing. Seated across from a panel of senior officers and an external investigator, Ethan was confronted with a thorough review of his actions. The hearing room was tense, the air heavy with judgment. Video evidence, along with statements from bystanders, painted a damning picture of Ethan's treatment of Samuel Bennett. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience in handling police misconduct cases, leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Officer Blake," she said, her tone sharp, "do you understand the gravity of your actions? This wasn't a routine arrest. You targeted a man based on unfounded assumptions. Your actions weren't just unprofessional. They were rooted in bias." Ethan, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to defend himself. "I was doing my job," he stammered. "I thought he looked suspicious." The investigator's expression hardened. "Suspicious? A man in a suit, walking his dog in his own neighborhood? Explain to me what about that scenario warranted suspicion." Ethan faltered, realizing there was no justifiable answer. The hearing continued with testimony from other officers, some of whom expressed concerns about Ethan's pattern of targeting minorities during his patrols. While no formal complaints had been filed before, the hearing revealed a troubling history of prejudice in his decision-making. As the panel deliberated, Ethan sat in silence, His usual bravado completely eroded. The verdict was swift and uncompromising. Ethan was suspended without pay pending further review and was required to attend a series of racial bias and sensitivity training sessions. The department also mandated community service at a local outreach center focused on supporting victims of systemic discrimination. The sensitivity training sessions were a rude awakening for Ethan. Initially, he approached them with resentment, treating the sessions as a mere formality to regain his badge. The first session, led by a passionate facilitator named Carlos, began with a powerful exercise. Participants were asked to listen to personal accounts from individuals who had been victims of racial profiling. One story, in particular, hit Ethan hard. A young black father recounted being stopped and searched in front of his children while on the way to a family picnic. "They saw me as a threat," the man said, his voice breaking. "My kids saw me as powerless." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, he began to see his actions through the eyes of those he had targeted. Each session forced him to confront the implicit biases that had shaped his behavior. Carlos challenged participants to reflect deeply, asking questions like, "What stories have you told yourself to justify your actions? And how will you rewrite those narratives moving forward?" Meanwhile, Ethan's community service at the Outreach Center placed him face-to-face with the consequences of systemic discrimination. He worked alongside volunteers, many of whom had experienced police profiling firsthand. One afternoon, as he sorted donations, a volunteer named Marcus struck up a conversation. "You're the cop from the news, right?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral but curious. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, that's me." Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You know, I used to think all cops were the enemy, but then I met one who actually listened, changed the way I saw things. Maybe you could be that kind of cop, too." The words lingered with Ethan long after their conversation. Slowly, he began to engage more sincerely with the people he met at the center. He listened to their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for change. By the end of his mandated sessions, Ethan was no longer the man who had smugly arrested Samuel Bennett without cause. He wasn't entirely transformed, but the seeds of change had been planted. For the first time, he recognized the weight of his badge, not as a symbol of power, but as a responsibility to serve and protect without prejudice. When his suspension ended, Ethan requested to remain involved in outreach work as part of his policing duties. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, but he was determined to start making amends. For Samuel Bennett, the courtroom confrontation wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a larger mission. The injustice he faced had ignited a fire within him, pushing him to transform his personal experience into a catalyst for systemic change. Samuel began by leveraging his connections with his brother, Governor Bennett, to spotlight the issue of racial profiling in law enforcement. Within days of the incident, Samuel and the governor stood side by side at a press conference, addressing a crowd of reporters and community leaders. Cameras flashed as Samuel spoke calmly but passionately. "What happened to me is not unique," he said, his voice steady. "It's a story countless others have lived, a story where prejudice overshadows justice. We cannot allow this to continue." The press conference sent shockwaves across the state, amplifying calls for immediate reform. Governor Bennett announced the introduction of a legislative package aimed at addressing racial bias in policing, dubbed the Equal Justice Initiative. The reforms included mandatory racial bias and sensitivity training for all law enforcement officers, increased oversight of police misconduct investigations with an independent review board, funding for body cameras to ensure transparency during encounters, enhanced penalties for officers found guilty of discriminatory practices. But Samuel knew policy changes alone wouldn't be enough. He dove into community engagement, hosting town halls in neighborhoods disproportionately affected by policing biases. These gatherings became platforms for open dialogue, where residents shared their experiences, frustrations, and ideas for change. Samuel listened intently, taking notes and promising to be a voice for their concerns. One evening, at a packed community center, A young man named Jamal stood up to speak. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "how do we trust that these reforms will actually work? We've heard promises before, and nothing changes." Samuel met Jamal's gaze. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he admitted, "but it starts with accountability, holding people like Officer Blake responsible and ensuring no one is above the law. That's why I'm here, not to make promises, but to fight for follow-through." Samuel's sincerity resonated with the audience, earning him a standing ovation. In addition to his grassroots efforts, Samuel worked closely with advocacy organizations to create educational programs for both law enforcement and civilians. Partnering with groups like the ACLU and NAACP, he helped develop workshops on implicit bias, effective community policing, and allyship. One of his proudest achievements was launching a mentorship program for young black men aspiring to careers in law or public service. He visited schools and community centers, encouraging students to channel their frustrations into action. "You have a voice," Samuel told them during one visit, "and when used wisely, it can challenge systems and inspire change. Don't let anyone silence you." Samuel also used his platform to highlight stories of resilience and courage. He collaborated with journalists to publish op-eds and participate in interviews, sharing his experience while advocating for systemic accountability. His story became a rallying cry, drawing national attention to the broader issue of racial bias in law enforcement. Meanwhile, Samuel kept a close eye on the reforms being implemented in his state. He pushed for regular progress reports and made sure that community leaders were involved in evaluating their effectiveness. His determination inspired others to join the fight, creating a coalition of activists, policymakers, and everyday citizens committed to meaningful change. As the months passed, Samuel's efforts began to bear fruit. Complaints of racial profiling in his state decreased, and community police relations started to improve. But Samuel knew the work was far from over. In a televised interview marking the one-year anniversary of his wrongful arrest, Samuel reflected on his journey. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about everyone who's ever been unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin. It's about creating a society where justice truly is blind." Months had passed since Samuel Bennett's wrongful arrest, and the day of reckoning for Officer Ethan Blake had finally arrived. The courtroom, once a stage for Samuel's humiliation, was now filled with anticipation as the disciplinary hearing began. The energy in the room was tense. Journalists, activists, and community members all gathered to witness the outcome of an incident that had sparked statewide reform. Samuel sat calmly in the gallery, his quiet presence commanding attention. Across the room, Ethan looked visibly uncomfortable, his confidence eroded by months of public backlash and professional scrutiny. His once defiant posture now seemed smaller as he nervously adjusted his tie, his gaze darting between Samuel and the judge. The hearing began with a review of Ethan's actions on the day of the arrest. Witness testimonies were read aloud, each one painting a damning picture of racial profiling and abuse of power. Surveillance footage was shown to the court, capturing Ethan's baseless accusations and excessive force against Samuel. The footage also highlighted Samuel's unwavering composure despite the degrading treatment he endured. The judge, a stern yet fair woman in her 60s, addressed Ethan directly. "Officer Blake," she began, her voice steady, "your actions on that day reflect a troubling misuse of authority. You targeted Mr. Bennett, not based on evidence or suspicion of wrongdoing, but on assumptions rooted in bias." Ethan stammered, trying to defend himself. "Your Honor, I was just doing my job." He looked suspicious. "Suspicious," the judge interrupted sharply, her tone laced with incredulity. "Walking a dog in a suburban neighborhood while wearing a suit? What part of that scenario justified your behavior?" Ethan's face flushed, and he fumbled for words. I didn't know who he was, and that's precisely the problem," the judge replied, her gaze piercing. "You didn't know, yet you assumed. Your duty as an officer is to uphold the law impartially, not act as judge, jury, and executioner based on personal biases. The courtroom murmured in agreement. Ethan's lawyer attempted to redirect the conversation, emphasizing Ethan's years of service and lack of prior disciplinary actions. But the judge wasn't swayed. Samuel's lawyer then stood, requesting permission for his client to speak. The judge nodded, and Samuel rose, his calm yet commanding voice filling the room. "Your Honor, I'm not here to seek vengeance," he began. "I'm here to seek accountability, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been subjected to similar treatment without the privilege of having their story heard." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the audience. After deliberation, the judge announced Ethan's sentence: suspension without pay, mandatory racial bias training, and 200 hours of community service in underserved neighborhoods. The ruling marked a significant step toward justice, though Samuel knew the fight was far from over. As the courtroom adjourned, Ethan approached Samuel hesitantly. I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Samuel met his eyes and simply said, "Prove it." Months after the courtroom hearing, Samuel Bennett's story had grown into a powerful movement. His wrongful arrest and the subsequent revelations about systemic bias in law enforcement sparked conversations that went far beyond his own experience. Samuel, always a man of action, used the momentum to drive meaningful change. Samuel worked closely with his brother, Governor Bennett, to introduce comprehensive legislative reforms addressing racial profiling and law enforcement accountability. The Equity in Policing Act mandated racial bias training for all officers, established independent oversight committees for police misconduct investigations, and required body cameras for increased transparency. The law passed with overwhelming support, marking a victory for justice advocates statewide. Meanwhile, Samuel became a sought-after speaker, sharing his experience at universities, community forums, and national conferences. His calm yet impassioned speeches resonated deeply, shedding light on the lived reality of racial profiling while offering hope for a better future. "This isn't just about one bad officer," he often said. "It's about a system that allows bias to thrive unchecked and the collective responsibility we all share to change it." Officer Ethan Blake, once the embodiment of unchecked privilege, faced his own journey of reckoning. His suspension and mandatory community service forced him to confront the realities of the neighborhoods he had once dismissed. Assigned to volunteer at a local youth center, Ethan worked alongside families struggling with systemic disadvantages. He heard their stories, saw their resilience, and began to understand the harm his assumptions had caused. Through this experience, Ethan began a slow but genuine transformation. He publicly admitted his mistakes in an op-ed published in the local paper, writing, "I failed to see the humanity in others because I never took the time to look. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I deeply regret the pain I caused." Ethan also reached out to Samuel, requesting a second chance to prove he had changed. Samuel, ever focused on accountability and growth, agreed to meet with him. The two men had a frank, open conversation, and while Samuel remained cautious, he acknowledged Ethan's efforts to take responsibility. The story of Samuel and Ethan became a case study in second chances and the power of accountability. Together, they filmed a public service announcement, urging communities and law enforcement to prioritize empathy, understanding, and reform. The PSA, titled Justice Through Humanity, went viral, sparking dialogue across the country. For Samuel, the experience was transformative in its own way. Walking through a suburban neighborhood one crisp morning, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Neighbors greeted him warmly, their nods carrying newfound respect. The memories of his wrongful arrest lingered, but so did the determination to keep fighting for change. As Samuel passed the same bus bench where the incident began, he paused, a small smile crossing his face, his briefcase in hand and head held high. He moved forward, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. The story closed with Samuel typing on his laptop late at night, drafting plans for his next initiative, a nationwide campaign to promote justice and equity. His screen lit up with the title of the project, a fitting reminder of his journey, a legacy of change,